Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be adding the add command, which will allow us to add expenses or sources of income into our data CSV in our program. Let's get right into it. So if you remember in a previous video, if we just do a go run period, it just gives us that root command output. And we don't want that. We want to be able to add our own commands to this program. So let's go ahead and add one. If we clear our terminal, we can type in cobra-cli add, and then we can give the name of the command that we want to add to this program. So it's just going to be add. And you should get some output back saying that the add command was created at a particular folder. Let's go investigate where it was created. If you go back and open up your CMD folder, you'll see a new add.go file that was added. So let's look into that. And if we take a brief look at it, it's exactly what we got in the root.go file that we originally generated with cobra-cli init, except we have the run function or the attribute filled in with a print line statement saying add called. If we go back down to the terminal, we can then do a go run period and then call add. So when we do that, it says add called, which is exactly what this run function is doing here. And then the rest of it is the init function where we can modify how this command behaves. Now we need to modify the behavior of the add command such that we can pass in an amount and the source of the expense. Because if we go and look at our expenses CSV, we don't want the user to have to worry about generating an ID or inputting whenever this expense was created. We just want the source from them and the amount. So let's further customize it. So go back to the add.go. We can remove several of these lines, and above the root command is where we can customize the add command a little bit more. First, I'll start out by adding a amount flag. So you can just do add command dot flags, which is a function, and we can add a float variable that we can assign the amount that the user will pass in. So you will do float 64 var p. Let's look at the argument list. It first takes in a float 64 and it has to be a pointer, then a name string, the shorthand of it, a value such as like the default value, and a usage string. Up at the top of the program, let's go ahead and create a variable that will represent our amount. So just by saying var amount float 64 should satisfy this. So then when we go back down here, we just pass in the reference to amount, then the name of our flag, so it's going to be amount. Next will be its shorthand, which is just going to be a single A, some default amount that we don't care about. And then I'm going to pass in a small little description here. It's amount or earned, and we'll just leave it there. So then I can save it. And that means that we can go ahead and call go run period and then add, and then we can do a dash A and pass in the amount. But before we get down that path, we'll go ahead and add our source. So very similar to this, we need to have a source variable declared at the top. So var source will be a string. And similarly, we'll add this to our add command. So add cmd.flags, and then instead of a float, it will be a string and it will be a variable. Pass in that reference to the source, name it however you would like, give whatever shorthand flag you would like it to have, some default value, and then lastly, a brief description. So source of income or expense. Now let's go ahead and prove we can actually print these out to the console or even do anything with these values. So here I will do a format.printf and I'll do amount is equal to %v and then do a new line and then have source equal to %v also. And we'll just pass in the amount and source. So when we go down to the terminal and we want to call this add function, we just type in -a and I will do 12.34 and then I will do source or -s job 1. So when I run this command, it will go ahead and print out the amount and source that we passed into it, right? And there we go. Amount is 12.34 and our source is job 1. So now we know that we can go ahead and pass data into this function from the terminal and print it out to the screen, but we still have a little bit of an issue here, and that's that users can call this command add without a source or an amount attached to it, but that should be required. So I will go ahead and remove that source, and we see that it's empty, and that's an issue. That shouldn't happen. These should be required flags and values that get passed in. So Cobra CLI and the Cobra package takes care of this for us, and we can add functions to this and make them required. So here I can do add cmd dot mark flag required, and then you just pass in the name of the flag that you need it to be required. So that will just be amount. And similarly, we can mark another required flag for source. And I should go ahead and add in the required. And there we go. So now when I go to try to run this function without the source, I'll get an error status, an exit status of 1. And it's because source was not set. And we can flip it and do it the other way around and it still won't work. So we've got great error handling so far. And here we can see that shorthand flag for amount and source and what it describes. Now let's go ahead and start writing some code to interact with that CSV file to add different expenses to it. So I'll go ahead and create a new folder within expense tracker, and it's going to be called utilities. Now you can name it whatever you want. I'm not trying to be architecturally correct here in this program, but within the utilities, we'll create a new file called expenseadder.go. And in here, we'll declare the package as utilities. And we're going to have several import statements. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up the parentheses here and just be prepared for lots and lots of imports. This utilities package, or particularly in the expenseadder.go, is just going to be purely for adding expenses to that CSV. So naturally, our function will be called add expense, and in it, it will need to take 2 arguments. So the amount, which is a float 64 that's coming over from the add.go command, and lastly, the source, which is a string. The first thing that we should do when trying to add an expense is to open the file. So here, we'll just do file error is going to be equal and assigned to os.openFile. And in here, we need to go ahead and pass in that file name, which I'll just pass in as a string, an empty string for now, but we'll fix it here soon. Next, we need to pass in the methods in which we want to open this file. So is it going to be read only, read write, append mode? So I'm going to do os.ordwr for read and write. And then since we're just going to be adding expenses, we really just want to append to this file. os.o_append will work. And then lastly, we pass in the file permissions, which I'm not going to get into the weeds, but 0644 will be just fine. Now, as is with Go error handling, we need to have the if error is not nil. Then we'll just print this out to standard error that there was an issue opening the file. So I can call it format.fprintf, write to os standard error, a format string that we would prefer. So we can just do error opening file. And since this is going to be kind of like an error, I'm going to lowercase it and actually not use punctuation at the end. And then we'll do an early return, so we try not to do anything else inside of this function. So if we pass that condition, that means that we have some sort of file to work with. So next we need to read in all of the records so that we can pull the last record's ID and then add 1 to it and give it back to our new record so that we have a new unique ID number. So what we'll need to do is read from the CSV file, which will need a CSV reader. So I will go ahead and create a CSV reader, which is going to be assigned to csv.newReader. And this just takes in a file. From here, we can go ahead and read in all of the records. So we can do records error is equal to csvreader.readAll. And then we need to go ahead and check that that error is not nil. So if error is not nil, we'll have another print statement. So fprintf out to os.standardError, error reading records from the file. And then we'll do another early return here. Now we should have all of our records available to us. And to take a brief pause here, what we'll do is we'll just print out all of the records. So format.println records. And temporarily, we'll go ahead and add in the file path to our data file. So data expenses.csv and save. So what we'll do is return back to the terminal, clear it out, and we'll do go run period add with an amount of 12.34 or whatever you want it to be, and then a source of job 1. Go ahead and hit enter, and we get amount is printed out, source is printed out, but nothing ran. Now to do a quick sanity check that we can get our records printed out to us, let's go back to our add.go file, which is where we define the add command, and we need to replace this run function with a call to the expense adder's add expense. So here, what I'll do is we'll just delete that line. We'll call utilities dot add expense, and then we can pass in the amount and source, and we should be good to go. So now just open up the terminal, do a go run period add with a source of whatever you want, and then an amount of, I'll just do 1234, hit enter, and then once we get something printed out to us, it's just actually the header of the CSV that we already have. So ID, source, amount, and created at. And you can see that this is actually a 2D array that it gives us. So if we go back into our data and expenses.csv, let's just see what it looks like when we add another entry in there. So we'll do job 1, 1234, and then I'm not even going to worry about the created at. We'll type in some random string there. And so when we do this again, don't mind the actual flags that I've passed into it. We'll see that we get that header printed again, and then the values and the second line. So what we're looking to do here is pluck out this ID that's sitting right here, and we'll add 1 to it if a record exists already in the CSV. But if no record exists in the CSV, then that means that we can just start off at 0 or 1 or whatever we prefer. So let's go ahead and delete that line and go back to our expense adder.go. So now our next objective is determining what ID number we're going to use when we insert a new record. If we look at this, we have our header already inserted, but that shouldn't count as a record. But when we go ahead and read from our records, we see that something gets printed out. So its length is equal to 1. And we can confirm this by deleting records, and we can do length of records. And when we go to rerun this, we get 1 is printed out. So let's write some logic to correctly generate a new ID number. Let's delete that line, and we'll say ID stir is going to be equal to 0. And then if the length of the records that we have here is greater than 1, meaning that we have at least 1 expense entry in this file, we need to take the last record in the CSV, extract its ID, convert it into the format so that we can add 1 to it, and then assign it back to ID string. And what we should do here, just to make it easier on everyone, instead of using a uint, we'll just make this as a string. I feel like that it's going to be the easiest thing for us here. So in here, we'll need to get the last record. So last record is going to be equal to records, and we can use the slice terminology here. So we can just do the length of records minus 1, which will grab that last record for us. And then we need to get the ID of that last record. So we'll say last record ID is equal to last record. And since each record is in itself an array, we just need to get the first element of it. So just do a 0 there for the index. And since we're treating IDs as strings here, we need to be able to increment this ID by 1. So now let's convert this into an integer. So we'll say last record ID int is going to be equal to stir converge dot, is it A to I always get it confused. A to I takes in a string and produces an int. So we'll say A to I, give it the last record ID. And since this produces an error, I don't really feel like checking this. If we're only ever going to be writing to this file, I think we can be confident that we're going to write integers into this spot. So we will just ignore that error. And then we can assign this last record ID int back into the ID string once we convert it back over. So we'll say ID stir is going to be equal to the stir converge dot I to A, and here it's just doing the inverse of what we just did up above, but we'll say last record ID int plus 1, and then that should properly instantiate our ID string to either be at 0 if it's going to be the first record in this file, or whatever the last record ID is plus 1. So let's cover this logic here one more time because there's kind of a lot going on. So first, if there's at least a record in the CSV, we will enter in this logic. We get the last record by getting the length of the records and subtracting 1 to get that last element, because remember, slices and arrays are indexed by starting at 0. Then we get the last record ID because we're working with a 2D array, and so we're already taking the first array and then now we need to get the first element in that first array. We then convert that ID from a string into an ID, and then we increment that ID as an integer by 1, convert it back to a string, and assign it to ID stir. So now that we have our latest ID generated, and we already have our amount, and we have our source, so now let's create that create_at timestamp. So we'll create a created_at variable that's equal to time.now, and then we call the format function on it by passing in time.rfc, and I believe it's 3339, which is a little bit more of a readable format for us. And now we can take all these variables and insert them into the expenses.csv. So now we need to create a CSV writer. So CSV writer is going to be equal to csv.new writer, and it's going to be that file that we just created from up above. And then you call csv writer.write, and in here it's going to take in a string slice. So you go ahead and create the string slice, pass in the ID stir, then the amount, source, and created_at, in which you don't use parentheses. I messed up here. You have to use the curly braces here. And that presents another issue because the amount is of float 64, and we also need to convert that over into cents. So if we just want to convert our amount over into cents, we just do amount in cents is going to be equal to int64 with the amount times 100, which means that we'll go ahead and move those 2 decimal places over to the left to make this a whole number. And so then when we pass it down here, we can just call amount in cents and just wrap it as a string, and we should be good to go. But whenever you call csv writer.write, it doesn't always write to the file immediately. It creates a buffer of writes. So we'll just go ahead and do csv writer.flush to make sure that makes it to the file, and we should be good to go. Now, if I go back down to the terminal and run this, we should see that 1, 2, 3, 4 and job 1 gets added along with a create_at timestamp and an ID string. So let's pull our expenses.csv off to the right. And since CSV should end in a new line, I'll go ahead and fix that. So then when I hit enter in the terminal, okay, so we had a couple issues here. We see that the 0 gets properly inserted, right? Because it only detected one entry in the CSV file, but also it didn't put it on a new line. So let's close out the expenses CSV and open it up in a bigger manner. And so when we go right here, we actually want it to be inserted right there. Then also we get some unknown symbol. It doesn't know what it was trying to insert right here. And that's because we just did a string to amount in cents, but that's not how the conversion really works. It produces a string of a rune rather than digits. So we just need to go ahead and use that stir converge package and convert it back over to a string like we did similarly up here. So let's go ahead and fix that issue. str converge dot I to a, wrap it the amount in cents there, which we also have to wrap this in int, and we should be good to go. And so when we go back to our expenses CSV, we just have to make sure that each entry ends with a new line. So there, I will go ahead and save it. And let's try this one more time. So when I do a go run with 1, 2, 3, 4 as my amount and job 1, we hit enter, and there we go. We get the new entry with 0 as our ID, our float, which was converted over into an integer in cents. So that's why we get the 2 extra zeros at the end. The source that it came from was job 1, and then we get a nice timestamp that it was in 2026 of January on the 22nd at this time at 7:04:05 within that time zone. That's it for the video. So in this video, we covered how to add expenses into our CSV and adding commands via the Cobra CLI. And in the next video, we'll work on how to list out all these expenses in a tabular format to the user in the terminal. If you made it this far, I hope you learned something, and please consider giving a like and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.